I'm Alexi Halkett. I'm 18 years old.
It was evidence of something that was very important to us.
We would all have a lot bigger say in the decisions of our local school boards, our zoning commissions, our city councils, if we had a media that was scaled appropriately to cover the things and inform people about the issues.
So we decided to make a record.
It shows that there is some division within Biden's people on this right now.
So it became evident early in telephone history that central offices were needed for switching calls.
I didn't think that anybody would care about it except for our 15 friends or 20 friends.
To make connections, the telephone companies used the most valuable invention of all time. To make connections, the telephone companies used the most valuable invention of all time. An invention for which, unfortunately, Bell System Research cannot take credit. The girl operator had all the qualifications that were required to make connections in those days.
For that time, you had to make a minimum of 1,000.
She had responsiveness.
Number please.
Operator. She had memory.
Parkway 32. Yes.
Same goes for culture.
Yesterday I got brought into the office because what I was wearing was deemed inappropriate. It looked too much like a sports bra.
But we figured, why not?
She had the mechanical dexterity to handle the switching process.
I'm sorry to patronize you.
And she had logic to select another route if no line was available.
Perhaps I can connect you through hospital.
Every town in America has someone who is at least as talented as Britney Spears, if not a little more so. But they all stay invisible, even in their own towns, because of the way that the airwaves are owned and operated.
Hartford, get me Boston, Parkway 32.
You can imagine, by the way, the interest that labels around the country had in a teenage punk rock band from Washington, D.C. that had broken up.
Memory, logic, and mechanical dexterity. All were there in that original switching system.
I mean, people often say, like, why did you decide to put out your own record? I'm like, are you kidding? Like, nope, there was no interest whatsoever. We didn't exist. It wasn't even, I mean, it wasn't that we weren't on the radar, it just we weren't even part of anything where the word radar could be used. We were non-existent. So, we decided to make this record. None of our parents are from the music business. We had no idea how to make a record. So we just asked one friend of ours who had put out records, said, how do you do that? He said, well, here's a phone number, call them.
And so they told me to cover up, and if I didn't have anything to cover up, that they would give me something to cover up. And I said, no, I don't think what I'm wearing is inappropriate.
You know, I understand the COVID thing, but now I kind of think that people are using COVID as an excuse. Like, you can't get into Congress anymore. Why don't they say you can get in if you've been vaccinated? You can't get in to see public broadcasting. And, you know, it's not like we didn't try. We called, we wrote, and emailed, we tweeted at them, got no response. So I think, you know, things are changing in a way where the public has this nice security guy said, becoming very private. And we've got to find ways to open the doors again and say, hey, these are services that you're supposed to provide for us, the public.
We came to deliver a petition about how PBS has refused to air a documentary that was made for PBS.
Why is it inappropriate? Why is my skin deemed inappropriate and over-sexualized? So I said no, I wouldn't cover up. So I was brought to the principal's office.
On how China had eliminated poverty. It's called Voices from the Frontline, China's War on Poverty. I had to watch it twice because it was so fascinating, and you can get it on YouTube, so go look at it. And so we came here to deliver a petition. We could not meet with anybody from PBS.
Where we had a not very good discussion, and so I took it to Facebook.
Not only couldn't we get in and talk to somebody, we couldn't stand on the outside of the building there. Then we couldn't stand on the area where the cars go in, and then we couldn't sit on the benches in front either. And they called first the security guards, and then they called the police.
I took it to Twitter, I took it to all my friends they invited their friends. There's thousands of people getting involved in this.
So I just want to say, something's wrong with this country, and something's wrong with the public broadcasting services that doesn't have any way for the public to interface with them.
To support women's rights and equality in school, and to be against the sexualization of women's bodies in school.
Then we took it's a 7-inch record, right? We took apart a picture sleeve from England. We pulled it apart to see how it was configured. So you can imagine, 7 by 7. If you open up, it's 14 inches with a little kind of flaps on the side that fold in. So we just opened it up, we sketched it on an 11 by 17 piece of paper, and then we put our own art into that. We just laid it out in there, and then we took that to a print shop and said, can you give us 1,000 of these? The guy ran them off. In a week we picked them up. 11 by 17 pieces of paper with this weird shaped art, and then using scissors and glue, we cut and folded every one of those record sleeves. That is the way Discord records work for the first 10,000 songs. When we travel, people say, do you mind if I record the show? I said, oh, no problem, just send me a copy of the tape. So we would, play maybe in Spokane, Washington, in a very strange, youth center in the basement of a former bank or something. And at some point down a few weeks later, somebody would just send me a cassette in the mail, and I'd just, cool, put it on the shelf.
At the FCC, Republicans and Democrats alike have learned the value of these small stations. This is thanks to the many friends we have made in DC in our quixotic 10-year quest to get tiny stations a place on the airwaves.
What I would like to do when I start is just talk a little bit about broadcast history. It's not something that people really learn very much about in high school history class, and I think that it tells us a lot about it tells us a lot about the way that governments control information and entertainment and basically our culture. And so I like to just go back to around where I think the story starts, which is around 1900 or so.
With continued research and development, Dr. Harold Arnold of Bell Telephone Laboratories improved the original design to obtain a better vacuum. The new tubes enabled engineers to build amplifiers which were effective voice boosters. At last, it was possible to complete the line from coast to coast. 1915, the first transcontinental telephone line made front-page news. But there were still telephone men who knew the job had only started.
One of the really rough problems is those vacuum tube amplifiers. Each one we use on the line adds its own distortion to the conversation. You're right. The amplifiers are a problem. Anyway, do any of you men know what the word telephone really means? It's from two Greek words meaning far and sound. And I would say that if we had one main job, all of us, it is to make darn sure that the far sound isn't. So we have got to improve those amplifiers.
You can actually have a sound that's as good quality as most any commercial broadcast station.
So we have got to improve those amplifiers.
Even though the equipment looks simple, it does give you that capability of having something that's good quality
So we have got
and
to improve those
give a good statement of how well this technology really works. Now, what's involved in this is pretty straightforward amount of equipment. people have this misconception of broadcast facilities, and they can be as complex and occupy an entire building or complex of buildings, or they can occupy something as small as a closet in somebody's room. It just depends on the level of sophistication and the resources behind it. And of course, the resources behind what we're doing are rather small, so therefore the operations themselves in most cases will be a minimalist type of operation, but yet again still quite capable of acting as a full-fledged broadcast station.
So we have got to improve those methods.
The basic elements that are involved in this process are, one, of course, a transmitter. Most people, again, have this conception of transmitters as these very huge pieces of equipment requiring all kinds of electrical power and various things to run. Well, that's not really the case. For example, in front of me, right here, this is actually a half-watt transmitter. This unit is quite capable of covering a distance anywhere from 1 to 4 miles, which is very adequate in most communities of a small size, a neighborhood, even a small town. A little transmitter like this could easily cover a small town area. They come in different sizes and shapes and power ratings. The power itself determines, in some respects, the area that's covered. The other determining factor is the height of the antenna and the efficiency of the antenna. Those are the two main things that will determine how far your signal goes. For example, this is another transmitter.
So we have got to improve those methods.
Here, these are all assembled trump kits that we have. Slide back a little bit. What we have on top is actually the same half-watt transmitter, but it's being amplified by a 15-watt amplifier right here. Below where all these little coils and things are. We have these boxes available so everything slides together and goes together in a very compact and reasonable manner. It's not really anything very big. You can see it's not 6 inches long, about 4 by 4 inches high and wide.
The way this country is growing, there'll be plenty of people who want to go. Once we get the cost down.
So it's a really very compact type of unit when the lid's put on and everything. These are your transmitters. This 15-watt unit can easily cover a distance up to maybe even 8 or 10 miles, depending on conditions and so forth. So those are the heart of the operation of the transmitters.
The problem is how? Well, I know one way. It is a waste of our customers' money for one pair of wires to carry only one conversation. You know, working on that carrier idea, it's still a long way from being good enough.
These are really incredible ones. Our concept was to play as we were. If we were mad or sad or happy or glad or whatever, we just dealt with the element. We never used a set list ever. We just played what occurred to us at that moment.
But what when there were many men at that distant place, and only one was meant to hear? This was the second major problem foreseen by Bell so many years ago. The problem of connecting or switching a given call to one specific person out of many.
Well, we've got to make it good enough. We'll need a carrier system that will send at least 5 conversations on.
Alright, so it's not a whole lot to it. We've got our cable in, which on the one end is the antenna base here, and then the other end is our plug. And then, like I said, here's our little sheet that shows adjustments that you can make. Alright, so there's our 3 kind of playing rods there. Right, that's going to give us our hopefully good signal ratio. And then this one's going to screw onto the top. So that looks like. So now for my measurement, I'm going to have to get a tape measure here that gets millimeters. And I'll go by this chart here. Wow, okay, so the lower the end, the higher the mass is going to be. We're going to be transmitting at a relatively high. So I'm going to guess about 125 millimeters. Because that's going to be maybe 130, and we'll see what that gives us on the SWR. Right, so as you can see, there's just not a lot to it. We've got our measurements taken up front. We've got our 3 ground elements here, and then I've got it hooked to satellite dish mount would work with that. Not a lot of weight and not a lot of wind load, so just keep that in mind.
All right, for our temporary install to test out the range of these things, here we go. 20 feet of piping. At the very top of that is our antenna. As you can see, we are transmitting. So let's take a quick look at the setup inside, and then we're on the road. All right, well here we are inside the 1670 AM radio station. This is my community radio station. I don't know that I've ever shared the exact setup. This is the building we built last year during COVID, and I moved just my radio equipment out here. You can see I've got my mixer board here. I've got the CF30 Panasonic Toughbook out here. That runs the Shoutcast stream and 1670 AM, my little Part 15 community radio station. That's hooked up to this. This is the Hamilton Rangemaster, and then I've got the antenna on the outside. With this setup, ideally during the day about 1.5 miles, at night 2 miles. That's about what you're going to get out of a Part 15 radio station. For today, for setting this up before I hand it off to somebody off the mountain to set up their own radio station, I'm going to be testing that FM antenna. I've gone ahead and set it up on the side like you saw. I've got this Reticus radio set up. We've got it down to about 0.5 watt, which is the lowest that this thing will go. I believe that's still within Part 15, but I'm not positive. And like I said, I don't usually mess with the FM side of things. I'm more of an AM radio guy. But to show what this thing is capable of under ideal conditions on the FM band, I thought it would be cool to take a drive around and see just how far this thing will transmit. If you've never seen my setup here, I've got this ability to do live shows, and really it's just a matter of turning up your MacKaye, everybody, 1670 AM radio. And I can slide that down and then cut back to the music, or I can slide it the other way and go all the way to just the microphone. And so this little mixer board does all that. Super simple to set this up. This was a flea market find, but you can find these online anywhere you want. So that's it. Let's take a ride. Let's get in the car. I'll just set the camera there and we'll just drive around and see what kind of range 0.5 watt with this antenna will get us.
When radio was first invented, it was really it was a combination of inventions of about 10 or 20 different inventors. It really wasn't Marconi so much as a whole bunch of different people working, competing to develop radio. And it was originally, actually Marconi originally wanted to use it as a tool to communicate with the dead. He wasn't very successful with that, but what he was successful at doing was getting a signal from point A to point B. And so his original vision of radio was that it would be for communicating between ships and shores from point to point. He basically thought of it as a communicating device, not as a medium of entertainment. That idea basically came from his office boy, a guy named David Sarnoff. And Sarnoff had this idea that you could build this box and you could sell people these boxes, and out would come music and entertainment and news and information. And his business model was that you would sell the box to people, they would buy it, and you would provide the content for free, just sort of as a public service to get people to buy the box. And that is how broadcast radio really started for the first bunch of years. At that moment, America was different. People were culturally different. It was kind of unheard of to let strangers into your house to talk to you. And the idea of having a salesman in your house was even more horrifying to people. So people at first thought that advertising on radio would be a total flop. And Sarnoff was among the people that refused to even consider putting advertisements on radio. They thought that most Americans would never allow a box that was a salesman to be in their house. Of course, the people that overestimate the taste and discernment of the American consumer are always the ones that lose. And within a few years, someone tried broadcast radio with advertisements, and it was remarkably successful. And they made tons and tons of money, not really necessarily by getting people to listen, but by convincing the people that wanted to advertise goods and services that they were getting people to listen. And so they started selling the product, which was the public's ears. They weren't really trying to sell entertainment per se or information per se. They were trying to sell the attention of people, and that was a kind of a novel idea at that moment. As soon as that happened, there was a crisis in spectrum allocation. Up until then, the main people that were using the spectrum were university professors, amateurs, people, quack doctors, all sorts of people were just sort of experimenting to see what the new medium would bring. But when advertising hit, there was very quickly a spectrum crisis because every venture capitalist wanted to jump on board and stake their claim in the ether, on the spectrum and get their little piece of it.
So here we are in Virginia. We're going into the headquarters for PBS because we want to hand in a petition about how they were censoring this documentary on China called Voices from the Front Lines, China's War on Poverty. It's a great documentary. So we want to go and see if we can hand in these.
And so in 1927, Herbert Hoover said, radio is the first industry I ever ran up against that begged me to regulate it. And it's interesting that they begged to be regulated because what the kind of regulation they were asking for was to shut the door. Whoever had spectrum at that moment would keep it. Whoever had not gotten any yet would not get any. And so it was a very effective way of keeping out competition on the airwaves. And after much lobbying, and after a very heavy political battle between a group of broadcast reformers, including some labor unions and professors and universities, there was a very contested political battle over who would control radio, and guess who lost? Anyone? We all lost, and basically a handful of corporations got the vast majority of the frequencies, and they said no one else. What they did then was, and it was interesting, the next 20 years, a lot of people talk about it as the golden age of radio, but there's another story to tell from that. Actually, Lee DeForest in 1945 or so, after 20 years of almost exclusively commercial radio, came out one day and issued this big statement that said, "What have you done to my baby? What I thought was going to be this wonderful medium that would educate the masses and have the working class listening to opera and have all kinds of news and information that would inspire people and enlighten public debate. Now it's nothing but a huckster salesman that is, hell-bent on selling soap to ladies in their living rooms." And a lot of people realized that it was just a crying shame what had happened to radio at that moment. And so when they allocated the FM band, what they did was they decided that they were going to leave a spot where non-commercial messages could fit, which was from 88 to 92, which is where you hear to this day most public radio, community radio, and so on. And so what happened then was they created FM, which was obviously a much better technology, much less noisy, much less subject to thunderstorms, creating static and so on. And what they did with it was they, at first, they designed this very interesting license. It was called a Class D community license, and it was mostly given out to high schools and colleges and neighborhood groups and groups along those lines. And what they did, there was this sort of giant blossoming of small-scale, local community radio that was just really very neighborhood-based. And that went for about 20 years, from 45 to 65, and there was basically like a much more grassroots form of radio than we really had, and some groups started really going after these licenses and creating the community stations that we know of today. Sort of the Pacificas and the WRTs and those sorts of stations. A along came in 1967 or so the Rockefeller Foundation and the Ford Foundation. These guys, they looked at the broadcasting of other countries and they said, America, I mean, it has all these little community radio stations and it has all these commercial stations, but it doesn't have anything like the BBC. And we really think that it's important that there be a national news service that comes into existence. Actually, they were mostly thinking about TV, and so they created PBS, and they pushed the government to create PBS, and they got their way. And they created, almost as an afterthought, National Public Radio. These were, relative to community radio, really well funded. And they proceeded over the course of the next 10, 15 years to professionalize and create this this new sort of radio empire in the non-commercial band.
That's hard to meet with somebody from the pub broadcasting system. And let me just say how important it is. You know, I understand the COVID thing, but now I kind of think that people are using COVID as an excuse. Like, you can't get into Congress anymore. Why don't they say you can get in if you've been vaccinated? You can't get in to see public broadcasting, and you know, it's not like we didn't try. We called and we wrote and emailed, we tweeted at them, got no response. So I think, you know, things are changing in a way where public has this nice security guys, they're becoming very private. And we've got to find ways to open the doors again and say, hey, these are services that you're supposed to provide for us, the public.
And at a certain moment in the mid-70s, they said, you know, all these little 10-watt stations, all these community groups, and they're sort of in our way. And we'd really like them all to just move out of our way. And so they went to the FCC, they made their case, and they got the entry-level 10-watt community radio license thrown out. And although a couple of them still survive to this day, they haven't issued a new 10-watt community license in about 25 years or so. So sort of fast-forwarding to the mid-'80s, people started to realize that that NPR had staged this little coup, and that there was no way for sort of ordinary community groups to start up. And that's where a group of where people sort of started this sort of nationwide resistance in the form of pirate radio. And the very first one was this guy that I know about. There's always been pirate radio, but the way pirate radio used to be, it was sort of more like, oh, you know, there would be some kids in their garage. They would figure out how to build the radio station, and they would be broadcasting, and the FCC agent would come and you know, open the door and say, all right, kid, you're real smart, but you're going to get in a lot of trouble here. If you don't stop right now, I'm going to tell your mom, and that's going to be the end of it. And it would sort of be, that would sort of solve it. There was other pirate radio. There was we'll see Alan Wiener this weekend. But what Mabon and Kintako did that was really different. He was a blind 45-year-old African American man who lived in a housing project, and he decided he was going to start his own radio station, and he just started broadcasting with 1 watt just to the people that lived in this housing project, and he basically created a little alternative press inside his little neighborhood, and he went for about 3 years without anybody noticing outside of the project. The day that changed was when a friend of his got beat up by the police as he was walking home one night, and Kintako went to the hospital and interviewed the guy and his son who had gotten beaten up, and you know, he took it back to the station. He played the interview, and the next day there were really big protests that got the local police incredibly scared. And about a week later, the FCC showed up for the first time after 3 years of broadcasting and said, you're going to interfere with airports, you're going to knock airplanes out of the sky, you've got to turn off that pirate radio station. And what Kontako did, which was a little different than what many people had done before, was he took that up as a challenge, and he called a press conference, and he said, look, I've been broadcasting for 3 years. Nobody's noticed. It's the FCC's job to prevent interference, technical interference, caused by radio broadcasting. How come they never noticed me before, if that was the issue? I think what happened is someone didn't like what I was saying. And if there's one thing the FCC is not supposed to do, it's not supposed to be regulating content. It's not supposed to be telling people what they're supposed to say and what they're not supposed to say on the radio. And by the way, I dare them to come and arrest me. And so he stood out there broadcasting with his transmitter, and nobody came and arrested him. So he took all the cameras. He said, okay, everybody, follow me. We're going downtown. And he went to the police station. He said, okay, I want somebody at the police station to arrest me. He knocked on the door, and no one would arrest him. And they were like, oh, it's not our jurisdiction exactly. That's a federal thing. He was like, okay, everybody, let's go to the federal building. So he went to the federal building, down a few blocks, and he said, someone arrest me. I'm broadcasting without a license. And basically, they didn't want to deal with it. They were sort of like, oh, well, I don't know what they said. They probably said, come back, make an appointment, And he turned to the media. He said, look, I'm going to keep on doing this until someone comes and stops me, because I think it's my right. And interestingly enough, no one ever did for many years. And it was just too embarrassing. It was obviously he was right, and obviously they were targeting him, not because he was knocking airplanes out of the sky. And a whole bunch of people around the country sort of saw this story and said, this guy's broadcasting without a license. This guy's not getting arrested. Hell. And it was interesting. The sort of next step of it was some lawyers approached him and said, look, we want to take this case to the courts. And there's an interesting legal argument they came up with. It's basically, the FCC, under the law, it has the right to regulate the broadcast spectrum. Basically, to prevent interference is the rationale behind it. But they're supposed to do so in the way that causes the least possible harm to the First Amendment. And they're supposed to create a radio system that is the most open to the public that it possibly can be. And these lawyers, they said, at the National Lawyers Guild, they said, we have a system where corporations own all the radio stations, and everybody else owns none of the radio stations. Is this the least restrictive possible means available to regulate the airwaves? They wanted to take this. They didn't care where it went. They wanted to get it up to the Supreme Court, and they wanted to see what would happen. Well, they did. Kontako didn't want to do that because he mostly just cared about his station. But another guy did want to do that, which was Stephen Donifer in Berkeley. And about 93 or so. And what Donifer did was he very deliberately and fairly publicly broke the same stupid law. And in his case, they did decide that they wanted to pursue him. First, they fined him $20,000. Then they tried to get an injunction against him. And when the case actually went before the judge said, well, gosh, that's the National Lawyers Guild has a very interesting argument. I'm not going to rule on it. I'm gonna have to think about this. And in the meantime, Stephen Donifer can continue to broadcast. So for about 4 years there was a federal judge that refused to grant an injunction against the pirate broadcaster. And that's when all the rest of us were like, whoa, We're doing that now. And within about a year, well, first of all, the first thing that he did was he went and he got a storefront. He opened up the doors. He said, everybody, there's no injunction against me from doing this. We're starting a radio station. And within a few months, he had 100 programmers on the air all the time in Berkeley, coming in and out. And, community radio licenses were pretty much reborn just without the licenses. And that's where a whole bunch of us jumped on board and started radio stations across the country.
All right, we're loaded up in the car. We are ready to rock and roll. Sorry about the position of the camera, angle of the camera, all the rest of it. We're flying solo today.
5 conversations on one line. Impossible? Not at all. Recent tests promise that these experimental waveguides may be able to transmit 200,000 telephone conversations at one time.
Well, I say, man, son get mashed up last night,
Get mashed up.
This car for some negotiation. I'm blood clot I carry on with about negotiation. Run them out of the boat's clot time like that. Just give me the key, man.
Mr. Man, that's a watch them language, man. Have some respect.
But in the process, they are not sharing something that is deeply important, which is culture. I know about people who have amazing collections of recordings, unbelievable, thousands of tapes, and they're in their basement, rotting away, close to the water, and when that person dies, are we done? You all right? 5 minutes, okay. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I feel that we can go one of two ways. We continue on this route of trying to pretend that the U.S. has the right and the ability to dictate what the world should look like. Go the other way, which is to understand that the U.S. is an empire in crisis, needs to take care of its problems here at home, like this pandemic, and has to decrease the enormous military budget that is eating up over half of our discretionary funds.
But it's another of the wonders of research and development that they are all here too in a modern telephone office.
Get mashed up.
This car about negotiation. Run them out of the boat's clot time like that. Just give me the key, man.
Mr. Man, that's a watch them language, man. Have some...
Then, in about 1990, Joey P., who was an old friend of ours who did sound, he was a sound man, he started doing shows with us, and he was mixing our shows in Washington. He would sit at the front doing the sound. And he just started running tapes because he was interested in the process of recording shows. We asked him to go on the road with us, and he said, would you buy me a box of tapes? And we said, sure. So we bought a big box of good cassette tapes, the gold ones, gold tapes. He just started running tape every night. In the beginning, we weren't great. We just said, okay, great. We have these tapes. We come home and we wouldn't listen to the tapes. Let me tell you something. If you're playing 6 and 7 nights out of a week and you're driving every day 4, 5, 6 hours, you know what you don't want to listen to on that drive? Is yourself, because it's horrible. It just drives you crazy because the experience of playing music, being in a band, when you're on a stage, it does not bear any resemblance to what it sounds like on the tape the next day. I often think it's probably something akin to someone filming you having sex or something. It just doesn't look so good. It just doesn't. It feels a lot better at the moment. But slowly, this pile just started to grow. We just took boxes. We'd come home and there'd be a box of tape we'd just stick literally into a closet.
Guys, I am not a good fan of those waves. At all.
We did not listen to these tapes. At some point around 1991, we'd already had about 300 tapes. And we said, what are we doing with these tapes? But at that point, we couldn't stop, right? Because it was just, that was just part of the routine. Just record, and just put these things away. So we had this idea that we would we would put in our records a flyer that would list all the recorded shows and then invite people. If people wanted to order them from us, we would do a 1-to-1 cassette copy. It's an unsustainable idea. Cooler heads prevailed. And that idea went out the window. But we kept playing. And we just kept piling up the tapes. Then, by the time we stopped playing, which is our last show was the end of 2002, we had played about 1,100 shows, almost 1,200 shows. We had about 800 or 850 recordings. And they're just sitting in boxes. And we had no idea, no one could go through them. What do you do with that much material? I mean, our shows were, the last few years were 2 hours each. That's a lot of recorded material. What do we do with this material?
Play by the hit-bound sound, cause we ready. Rigging and you jigging to the dan-dapper daddy. I meet them call daddy Freddy, say you ready? Jungle is, are you ready? Make me see the light in your hand, are you ready? Wow, jungle is, are you ready? Run from police style when they want it. Don't live in no house if me know it haunted. As a tapper, you fit think positive. You really can't afford to go and then get your love it. Chest rasta no like your big Apollo boy George and go put on a wig. Respect the country where you live. Every morning me wake up and make a bill for it. This and it. Bad boy patrol is at the road boy patrol, yeah. Bad boy patrol is at the road boy patrol, yeah. Bad boy patrol is at the road boy patrol, yeah. Bad boy patrol is at the road boy patrol. Again, road boy patrol is at the bad boy patrol, yeah. Bad boy patrol is at the road boy patrol, yeah. Bad boy patrol is at the bad boy patrol, yeah. Nobody call no police for me, but this is not a case of emergency.
We're coming to you live from a rooftop in Oakland, California, above a major broadcasting facility in order to bring you important information. It's a special break, news break. The Energy Television Frequency